Hi, we continue in Genesis 41 today as the narrator takes over to tell us about the years of abundance. But the years of famine will take a lot longer to narrate. We'll see they continue all the way through chapter 47, which we've already seen was Joseph exchanging grain for everything from the people, their money, their livestock, their land, and their very lives. So it's important that we keep that in mind as we begin to look at this scene, because our initial impression, if we were just reading it in its narrative sequence here, is what a wonderful plan. They're storing up all this grain and they can pass it out to people in the years of famine. But of course, they're not going to pass it out. They're going to sell it, and the price is going to be as high as it possibly can be. So as we enter in our passage, we'll just take stock of where we are in our story. We can see on the right side of the screen we're completing this triptych we've been looking at from these three chapters. And we've also been looking at how, as we move forward from chapter 41 through chapter 45, we see a series of binary encounters, as you can see, color-coded, varying from Joseph and Pharaoh, Jacob and Joseph's brothers, etc. But we don't see that in our immediate scene. Our immediate scene is simply the narrator, and then Joseph seemingly by himself. His Egyptian wife is mentioned, but she's not in the story. It's just him talking to who knows who. As we've been also looking at this chapter, we've seen, as along with chapter 40, a whole series of rare Hebrew words, and that continues in our situation here. If you downloaded one of the earlier versions of it, well, I had missed hardship last time, so this is posted at radicalbible.net in the improved form. And as we look at our keywords and our shape, we're just going to look at this section here. Note that Joseph's two sons come out of this section of times of plenty. And then next time we'll look at the years of famine, which end the chapter. But the years of famine, as I note, will continue for many chapters forward. So let's just jump right into it. And we see, starting in verse 47, as the narrator takes over, during the 7 plenteous years, not the earth, why the New RSV would put earth for ha'eretz, which has been the land so many times. And so I translated it consistently here as land, although it's not highlighted because it's not all the land, but it's not a word for earth there. It's simply the land as it's been all along. So the land produced abundantly, literally by handfuls, and we see that word a number of times in here. I didn't put it exactly as a key word. I could have. It's 6 times throughout, but it's spread around and only a couple times in our immediate passage, so I didn't count it as a key word there. So now that's the general summary, and now we see what happens. And as we note what the narrator is telling us, what the narrator is not telling us. Yes, the land produced abundantly, but how does it do that? This is not like the manna in Exodus 16 where it just appears and people pick it up, nor is it like the garden in Genesis 2 where God provides the food. This is imperial slave labor agriculture, and there's no doubt about that. We'll find out later in chapter 47 again that all the Egyptians become enslaved, but of course in the Exodus story, I'm sure we already know, it's the Israelites who are enslaved, building precisely storage cities for grain. Not to mention the people who are digging and maintaining the canals, and the people who are in the hot Egyptian sun doing the harvesting. So it's slave labor and imperial economics that are at work here. This is hardly local farmers contributing their share to the common good. This is all about a hierarchical imperial society, and Joseph is now in charge of it. And notice it's described as a single-handed action. Egypt is a gigantic place, and the agricultural extent of the Nile spreads for a long way. But you'd think he was doing this single-handedly without what must necessarily be staffs of hundreds of people to be doing this. So it's presenting it as if it's a one-man operation, and Pharaoh is nowhere to be seen. Joseph is truly described as in charge of the agricultural economy of the Empire of Egypt. As Sarna notes below, Joseph becomes Secretary of Agriculture. There are also some issues with the NORSV here. We see he gathered here, and then we see a sequence of stored up, and stored up. But actually, this one is not actually say stored up, and these are all different verbs. So it might look like there's a triplet of stored up, but that's a mistake on the New RSV's part. So let's look at more closely what happens. So he gathered here using a word we saw in verse 35, and we'll see it one more time, 128 times in Hebrew Scripture, but it's not used in the Exodus regarding the manna. As my note continues, it has become his gathering, not theirs. The word for food here is okel, which is 3 times in the verse. Notice the contrast of what we'll see in verse 54 and 55 and throughout the story of the brothers coming back, which is lechem for bread. But here it's okel for food, which is suggesting not just the grain, but whatever they could get generically. And that's again 3 times in the verse. So he gathered up all the okel of the 7 years. So the 7 years are compressed into these few verses here. When there was plenty in the land of Egypt, and stored up Here it is, and he gave food in the cities. So this is actually not suggesting stored up. This is suggesting he gave it to people, but perhaps what it's doing is storing it up in the cities, perhaps precisely the kind of storage cities that the Israelites will later be responsible for building. And we already talked about cities earlier in verse 35. And he stored up in every city the food here. And my note below has the construct noun field the city suggests the link between the local fields in each city, now appropriated by empire for its own purposes. So that's what we see here in Seda Ha'ir here, the field the city, omitted here from the New RSV. From the fields, here it is seen in the fields. So food from the fields around it. Highlighting that relationship. And it's a classic imperial relationship where everything is produced in the periphery and is generated into the center. So it still emphasizes this here, and it emphasizes in great hyperbole here. He stored up grain, literally piled up, and that's the image. The image is not so much that it's stored up like in storehouses, but it's a gigantic pile. Grain here is not in the Hebrew. He simply stored up in such abundance like the sand of the sea, which will recall for alert readers the promise of God's abundance of offspring, not imperial surplus. And again, for those who want to read Joseph as some kind of hero here, if we're reading the larger context of the narrative of Genesis, he's plainly not. He's presented here as functioning within the imperial economy, and readers ought to recognize that he's taking precisely the place of the Creator in providing for this here. And this phrase is really confusing in the Hebrew. The word for stopped here, hadal, here is for ceased, and it refers to stop building the city here. And Sarai in chapter 18 of ceased being in the way of women. But there is no word for measuring any more than there was a word for storing in those verses. It's perhaps better translated as it was simply without number. And so it doesn't suggest he was measuring it at all. It suggests he was simply piling it up and piling it up. Where are we supposed to picture it piled up? In grain silos, in cities? It doesn't describe all that. It just simply emphasizes the abundance. And it does it quickly enough to just emphasize the pile without drawing attention to what I was trying to draw attention to was all the workers who were involved in producing this. Again, not manna, not something just appeared spontaneously and they're going to collect it for a time when there's a drought. So the production of grain, though, on the land is connected with the production of children. And this is not imperial economy, or is it? As my note below has, these verses 50 to 52 are an interlude linking the fertility of the earth under Joseph's oversight with personal fertility, both a matter of tapping into Egypt's motherhood, which we'll see more of a little later. So before the years of famine came, so within these 7 years here, but it's not specified when, Joseph had 2 sons, and we'll look more at the verse in a minute, but let's look at our note below. The medieval Midrash is Rashi, quoting the Talmud, suggesting the point is that procreation, even marital relations, is forbidden in time of famine, so better have those children now. As my note continues, in Hebrew word order, the fertility comes before the famine, linking, whereas we have here, before the years of famine come. So the children come first and then the years of famine, highlighting that this is connected with the fertility. And as my note continues further, note the retrospective on Abraham, Sarah in Egypt in the time of famine back in chapter 10, concerned about Pharaoh's taking of Sarah. And also in the repeat in chapter 26 when it's Isaac. And the Midrashic suggestion that Abimelech is Isaac's father, which we looked at when we looked at those chapters back there. So before the years of famine, Joseph had 2 sons, and we're hearing for the second time that his wife, or woman, Asenath, is the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, really highlighting the international, intercultural nature of this, or we could put it as the imperial colonization of an Israelite, or a would-be Israelite. And it's interesting in light of the Joseph and Asenath novel from much later, where the story insists that before they could get married that Asenath becomes Jewish. Some scholars have positioned this story as a positive intercultural marriage situation over against, as we looked at last time, texts like Ezra 7:25 and 26, and which involve obeying the law of the God and the law of the king, and later in Ezra that absolutely forbid international marriages based on Deuteronomy and the reforms in Deuteronomy that Josiah is almost certainly responsible for in the 7th century BCE before exile. But that's assuming that what we're seeing here is meant to be seen as positive, that Joseph's marriage to the Egyptian priest's daughter is simply a multicultural marriage or the acceptance of foreigners. rather than investing him deeply in the course of not only empire, but the Egyptian religion that legitimizes that empire. He's come a long way from Yahweh at this point, and I don't see any basis, if we're reading the story in its own context, where we can see Joseph as anything but someone leading his people astray. And in these couple of verses, we see some of the conflict here and the paradox in what's involved. Because we'll look at it later in the book when Jacob comes to bless his sons, his grandsons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and what that might have to do with the tribes. But we have to note here that Manasseh and Ephraim, as having Egyptian mothers, raises real questions about the tribal alliance of the Israelites. If we look at the map here, we can see that Manasseh, according to the descriptions in Joshua where the tribal allotments are made, covers a huge amount of territory and is often referred to as the half-tribe of Manasseh, referring to the part here, West Manasseh, on that side of the Jordan, and East Manasseh on the other side of the Jordan, in what is largely now Syria here. You maybe can't see, it's too small on your screen, but Golan here is the Golan Heights. In very recent struggles in the Middle East, we certainly know that's Syria here. Whereas Ephraim is here, and of course, neither of these are close to Egypt, which is farther down here, of course, south of Judah and even south of Simeon. So these two geographic places are incorporated in here. So what is it and when is it that they would be associated with an Israelite mother? And I'm going to skip that question for now until we get to the later chapters. But I will note a couple things about the use of those names as we go through our verses right now. So the issue of Manasseh and Ephraim, as I was noting, will come up in chapter 48 and then in chapter 50. So he named the firstborn Manasseh. Manasseh as a king is over against Ephraim in the monarchy, in the very late monarchy, and the Judahite authors blame Manasseh for the exile, despite Josiah and others. And I won't get in the details of my note below, but that's just some of the evidence around the question of composition when the Joseph story is written for other texts to know the story of Manasseh as a tribal name. And so here's, putting that question aside for now, let's just look at what Joseph has to say about how he names this child. And that recalls, of course, I shouldn't say of course, because you might not have watched that series, the wives Leah and Rachel going back and forth and giving explanations for the name of the children of Jacob in the first place. So since these will be tribal designates, they share in that sequence of having the name, meaning of their names given. But in this case, not by their mother, who's not in the scene except by mention, but by their father, Joseph. And what he names him is absurd at a couple of levels. Let's look at that. For he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Well, obviously, neither of those are true. And he'll bring them up repeatedly in his toying with his brothers and even with his father in the chapters that unfold. He will not forget his hardship and he will not forget his father's house for a single moment. But in addition to that, he attributes this all to God. He attributes to God something that actually hasn't happened, that he hasn't forgotten. And this is typical of Joseph, calling upon God to justify something that he's doing with no evidence at all that Joseph's in any relationship with Yahweh, let alone Elohim, who's mentioned here. And Yahweh is never mentioned in association with Joseph. And Joseph is never said to be in prayer or in any direct encounter with God at all. Like so many imperial people, he simply calls God to be on his side and trusts that people won't notice that he's just making that up. And many commentators have fallen for it. So God has made me forget, and notice the contrast with the remembering of the cupbearer and the baker, and the cupbearer's forgetting that kept Joseph in the dungeon for a couple more years. All my hardship, and the note at verse 41 is to highlight the use of all, mostly around all the land of Egypt, as we've seen, and hardship. Amal here, another one of the rare words we see, and mostly late, and that's a little piece of evidence this is a late story from the Psalms, Job, and Proverbs, and Koheleth, or Ecclesiastes, all understood as exilic or post-exilic texts. All the Psalms come from many periods. And forget all my father's house. And plainly, he will not forget anything about his father's house. Are we supposed to understand that he believes that at this point? That he's actually forgotten it? In the very naming, it's like, don't think about elephants, and you can't help but think about elephants. And every time he sees his son Manasseh, he's going to remember what he's telling us right now, or whoever he's talking to, that he forgot. And so the second one he named Ephraim. And Ephraim, as my note below has, is one of the most frequently named tribes in the Hebrew Scriptures, 180 times. as my note below suggests, possibly linked with Manasseh and Benjamin of those of the, quote, Exodus group, in contrast to the Leah tribes as part of the earlier settlers rooted in the southern Yahweh traditions. But I'm not going to try to parse that all out, and scholars continue to argue about what the original sequence of tribes might be and whether they reflect other issues like squabbles among priests and Levites, etc. But I do note that in contrast with Manasseh, at the beginning of Samuel, Manasseh not mentioned in the books of Samuel, has the origin of Samuel in the Ephraimites. And then in Hosea, as you can see, 37 times of the 180 times in the Hebrew Bible, Ephraim is there, and it's a quasi-synonym for Israel, because although Hosea will refer to Ephraim among the tribes of Israel, it's often in contrast with Judah as a whole. And there's perhaps a suggestion that Ephraim will become a synonym for Samaria in the post-Assyrian conquest tradition, although in the Ezra-Nehemiah tradition, where Samaria is the enemy, it's not referred to that way. But it will be in other contexts we'll look at in other videos. And again, he calls upon God for the naming, again with no evidence. For God has made me fruitful, and he certainly is fruitful, or at least Egypt is fruitful. I guess we can call him fruitful because he has two sons. In the land of my misfortunes here, Ani here, and we saw that once other time. But notice that all these other uses in Exodus 3:7, 17, 4:31, and Deuteronomy 26:7 are of this very land, of misfortunes in Egypt, where Yahweh looks on the affliction. Let's look at 3:7, which is a classic one here. Then Yahweh said, I observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard the cry and account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them, or to liberate them, from precisely what Joseph has put them in a position to be imprisoned by. So Joseph may feel fruitful in the land of his misfortunes, but the land of his misfortunes will be the land of his successors and his descendants' misfortunes for 400 years, according to the narrative. And then the 7 years of plenty that prevailed come to an end. And we'll see how this plays out much more slowly, where Joseph is not going to just distribute it to hungry people, but he's going to sell it to whoever can afford it. And we'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.